It's a wonderful honor to welcome Darren Stella. He is the professor of history at the City College of New York. And today we're discussing his post associate, the great Professor Michael Sugru. Darren, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. I have to correct you on one thing. I used to be professor of history at City College. Now I'm at the Hamilton Center at University of Florida.
Wonderful. Okay. So,
Okay. Okay.
so when did you change your place of employment?
So I just started here about 2 weeks ago.
Mhm. Okay. So tell me more about the Hamilton Center.
Well, it's one of a series of state authorized basically civics and Western civ centers in the United States. There's one here in Florida. There's another one in North Carolina. I think they're setting one up in Tennessee. They've got something in Arizona. It's a new movement, but basically a lot of it is actually to do the sort of stuff Mike did. Great books.
So tell me about the last time that you and Professor Sugru had a chance to meet.
Well, we physically met probably a year before his death. I went down actually to see him and go fishing. He was a huge fan of fishing. He loved to fish. And he lived down in Florida as well. So we went down to the Florida Keys, him and some other buddies, and rented a or chartered a boat and went out and caught grouper and other game fish, and had a chance to chat. But already it was taxing for him to be on the water. I mean, and he was just, when he was younger, he could spend days. He just loved fishing.
And I believe his last place of employment where he taught last was the Ave Maria University, yeah, in Florida.
That's correct. Yeah, down in Naples, Florida.
That's it. Yeah. So what is it about Florida that appealed to him and I suppose to you as well?
Well, what appealed to him, I think, was the idea of teaching at that school with his wife,
Mm.
and you know, he'd been coming from Princeton, where he'd been teaching for years, and I think he was looking for a more secure position and something new and different. As for myself, um, it's not Florida per se. Nothing wrong with Florida; it's lovely. But I think we really do need to get back to some of the old ideals of studying great books of the Western intellectual tradition and uh, teaching sort of, the traditional uh, um, knowledge we used to import about Western and particularly American history and culture as well. And I think it's sort of fallen by the wayside in recent decades. And I had actually retired, and I thought this was a chance to come out of retirement and maybe do something helpful to make bring some of that education back. I mean, you're much younger, so you are a better person to answer this or speak to it. But my experience was that as we moved away from that instruction, the interest and pleasure of the students actually waned. I mean, it was hard work, and so there was always some pushback on that. But once they'd done the hard work, they always seemed to feel very satisfied and happy and powerful, empowered. They could, they read important works, they knew important things, and they could comment in an informed way with each other. And I got the feeling as we moved away from that, and maybe it was just entirely coincidental, one thing had nothing to do with the other, but my sense was that students were less satisfied with their education and with the process. But you're younger than me, you can speak to that much more fruitfully.
Yeah, I suppose that is a sentiment that can completely sympathize with. I certainly feel there's a certain lack of fulfillment, so to speak, in the education that I've received thus far in my college years. Um, and it speaks to, I suppose, Michael Sugru's great mentor, Alan Bloom, and his book, The Closing of the American Mind. It's incredible how that work is still resonating with us today. So first, I suppose I'm very interested in the Great Books program. I know that it has a long history, starting in the, I suppose, beginning to mid 20th century.
Yes,
Adler, I believe, was a great proponent of that program.
yes, there were many. One of the first actually was my old alma mater, which was Columbia. They had, during the First World War, instituted something called war, I think war issues or war issues course. But after that, it morphed into a course called Contemporary Civilization, which was basically a great books of a political thought course. And that became really a flagship part of their curriculum. They fleshed it out over the decades. They added literature, art, music, and then a little science requirement. But you're right. I mean, Chicago had a very robust program, probably the most robust, because it's pretty much all they do is St. John's in out west, and then they have another main campus, I think, in Maryland.
So what books are considered great?
Well, that's part of the fun of teaching it, is that there's a very long list. We can always add and we can subtract. So there's plenty of room for debate. I mean, I remember when the canon war started, thinking that a pox on both your houses. I mean, of course there's a canon, but canon shift. I mean, all the time. Works rise, works fall. And it's not just true in philosophy, it's true in literature, it's true in music, it's true in painting. You know, we think, you know, we know who the greats are now, right? Jan Vermeer. But in the early 20th century, Jan Vermeer was not very hard to buy. There aren't that many of them. People didn't think very highly of him. He moved up. People move up, they move down. There was an artistic movement in Great Britain in the late 19th century that whole goal was to knock down all of the high Renaissance art. They called themselves the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood because they were like, Raphael, Michelangelo, no. Botticelli, that's the answer. And but you know, they go up and down. So for them, Raphael was not the universal genius that he'd been considered before. Same thing happens in music. You know, I mean, one age likes Mozart, the next age likes Beethoven.
Yeah, and
So they're all in the canon. I mean, it's just if you discover new things you think that are exciting, you might move them in. You might also say this is in the canon, but it's not at the apex, so we can move it down.
that's it. Yeah. I remember in my last term of study in Budapest, Hungary, there was a course where we walked through the American literary canon, and a text by one Harold Bloom, another great Bloom, appeared,
Yeah.
and I think I can tell right away that the sentiments that Bloom espouses, at least in the preface to his great Western canon work, uh, does not find much sympathy within my classmates who believe that the existence of a canon alone suggests a certain form of elitism, or
Yeah.
or something like that. Yeah, if not other kinds of prejudices. So, in your view, how would you make the case for a canon?
Well, first I would plead nolo contendere on elitism. That is absolutely the point of a canon, is that some things are weak. Critical judgment has judged them as superior. You can make a case that they've made a mistake, that things should move up or down, sure. But it strikes me that it's very hard. I mean, unless you want to argue that all literature is good as any other literature, that, you know, Tom and Jerry cartoons are every bit as good as Shakespeare. Um, you do actually, we are in our literary tastes elitist. We're looking at things that are, you know, more challenging, more provocative, more influential, and that have endured over time. Again, that can shift. But if your objection to that is that, well, you're really grading some things higher than others, you're going to have why have that principle only for literature? Why not have it for professional sports? Why does the team that score the most points in basketball win? That's very elitist. Of course it is. So that doesn't strike me as a very profound criticism. A more profound criticism would be, and people do make it occasionally, is that the selection of the canon is sometimes passes over things that are ignored or that are that should require a second look, and that some things on the canon are overrated. So Mike and I actually did a couple unplugged podcasts where, and that's a legitimate criticism, and it's a necessary criticism to keep the canon from becoming just dead. Is that you have to constantly evaluate, is this really as great as we thought it was? Or, yeah, I thought this was the greatest novel, but then there's been a novel put out 6 years later that does similar things, or 3 years ago, let's say, or well, currently, that actually does much of the same work in the same way and does it better. And so, you do have to rejudge. And, Harold Bloom had, I think, his canon is one, but I don't put it this way. I don't think it's exhaustive. And while I think everything on it belongs there, some of them I think are overrated and some are underrated, but that's what you have conversations for, to get a different sense of, okay, I see what you see, but I have a slightly different taste or slightly different preference.
Yeah. Right. So I suppose another reason why the idea of a canon is meets with much rejection from people of my own age is that they believe that, or at least they do not believe that a text written centuries ago have things to teach us today. So they carry with them a certain historicist bias that we are much more advanced and progressive age now, and they kind of believe that such books written before the birth of Christ can teach us anything. And I suppose that you and Michael, Professor Sugru, is helping to challenge that notion. So how would you do that?
Well, I think the easiest way to do that is to simply expose them to it. I mean, I think that students often think that because they've been told that, and it's at first glance a plausible argument. The question is, will that conviction endure after contact with some of these texts? Perhaps so. I mean, and perhaps people will come around with super modernist tastes. But if you think, for example, let's leave philosophy aside. Let's talk about literature. If you think that there's nothing written before your lifetime, or nothing written 300 years ago is any good, then I guess I'm going to ask you, well, then what is good? Right? So Shakespeare's gone. Goethe's gone. There's just no point in reading that. He's old and stuffy. And we're not reading Cervantes. And maybe we've even gotten rid of the 19th century. So there's no, Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or George Eliot or fine. And then I'm left with the question, so what are you reading? And at that point, I mean, we're not, by the way, getting rid of a canon. We're simply temporarily cutting the canon to the present. And, it becomes an interesting thing because once you cut a lot of those books out, subsequently written books, current books, recent books, don't make a lot of sense if you haven't read them because they're in dialogue with those. So, for example, look, let's say everything before 60 stinks. And that's pretty much what they've been taught to think because that's considered the present, although it's 50 years before their birth. But that's okay. That's when the professors tapped in. One of the great 1960s novels that, it should probably be in the canon and I think Bloom mentions it, is A Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole. And it's a wonderful comic novel. If you've never read it, it's worth reading. It's very funny. It's very thoughtful, and it takes place in Louisiana in 1960s. Um, it's awfully hard to make much sense out of that, to get the full sense. If you haven't read, well, Boethius, because one of the characters um, is obsessed with Boethius and he teaches it at like local college as an adjunct or a lecturer. And it's awfully hard to make sense out of it if you haven't read Aristotle, because he has a bar scene where some, street sharp guy is talking nonsense, but he's actually, if you've read Aristotle, this guy who is probably, the character is probably functionally illiterate, is actually recapitulating a lot of Aristotle's arguments in street lingo. And you lose the comic effect if you don't have that connect. So if you don't know the Aristotle and Boethius, you're not going to get as much out of Toole as you might otherwise. And that's how that works. So, no more old Cervantes, no more old Shakespeare. We're going to read, Latin American, South American magical realism. Good luck getting through Borges' Labyrinth without having read Shakespeare and having read, basically the Western canon, because it's all in there in playful ways. It's all alluded to. His classic short story with Swan, Ukbar, Tertius, Orbis. If you don't know anything about Western metaphysics, you're not going to get any of the jokes, any of the play, and any of the weirdness. And then you're going to miss the big payoff punchline at the end, which is profound. But you're not going to make sense of it if you don't know what he's alluding to.
So, from the perspective of Professor Sugru, what is the purpose of an intellectual and a teacher?
Well, I think Mike believed strongly that the function of the teacher is to engage the student in a process of self-learning and self-discovery through a very open-ended engagement with some of the most challenging and important works that have been produced, and that should empower the student to examine their own beliefs and their own convictions and refine them and have the power to defend their beliefs, at the same time understand and appreciate the beliefs of others. This was a mantra we both shared, which is that you don't teach people things they disagree with or that they came in disagreeing with to change their mind. If you change their mind, you screwed up. You went too far. You assign it to open their mind, and then they'll figure out what they believe. But and I thought, Mike was spectacular at this, which is if you came in being a Kantian, he was going to read you Hume. If you came in as a Humean, he was going to read you Kant. Whatever you thought, he's not trying to change your mind. He's trying to open it to say, do you understand the arguments against? Do you have responses? Do you respect the integrity and the power, the appeal of the people who disagree with you? Because you're going to have to find a way, if we're going to make it, to disagree without being disagreeable, and to respect and understand different opinions, because some of those convictions are legitimate. They're just not yours. And again, this goes back to like our thing on underrated and overrated. Mike and I had a slight disagreement. I have a big disagreement with Bloom. I'm not a big Walt Whitman fan. He loves Walt Whitman. That's fine. I don't think Walt Whitman's bad. I just don't think he's as great as he thinks he is. That's a perfectly healthy dialogue to have, and it evokes maybe different tastes, or different ideas of what the function of poetry should be. So he puts Whitman very high. He puts Dickens high. I like them both. I think they certainly belong in the canon. Um, I don't know. I put Melville a little higher, but maybe that's just my taste. But that's a very interesting. You can't have that debate without having some standards and some canon to push back on.
Mhm. Yeah. And yeah, to your point, I think when I was introduced to English language poetry, I used to really like Whitman. I still find him quite brilliant, but at the same time, I agree
Yeah.
with Ross in that you know, writing poetry without a structure is like playing tennis without the net.
Yeah, I mean, look, it can sometimes be extremely impressive and powerful. Um, some of the war poetry of E. E. Cummings achieves its effect, and maybe it is a question of how much you need the rules. But E. E. Cummings, T.S. Eliot, I don't have a tough time making the call, but it's not that I denigrate E. E. Cummings. Great. Same thing with Walt Whitman. I mean, I really like Walt Whitman. My taste is more Emily Dickinson. That's me.
Let's see. Yeah, yeah, I'm slowly gravitating towards Dickinson's poetry too.
Yeah,
There's
she's a marvel. She's a pleasure.
there's a beauty in her diction which can strike people as simplistic at first glance.
Well, I think in part because we have different ideas of the beautiful, and some of us have become jaundiced about
Mhm.
beauty. I think that's a side conversation Mike and I used to have, which is I'm always been more concerned with aesthetics than him. He just didn't take. I mean, he was interested in it. We used to go to museums together, but I'm I don't want to overstate this, but I think with the rise of certain modernist styles in particularly in painting in the last 120 years, there's been a real denigration of the centrality of beauty. Now, that had happened before. I mean, there's different aesthetic values. There's a lot of 19th century stuff. Delacroix is amazing, but it's not meant to be beautiful. It's meant to be sublime. Right? It's meant to inspire terror. A great example is some of the seascapes, stormscapes of Turner. Wonderful. But I think even even then, the sublime was always counterpoised to beautiful. And I think in not entirely, but in a large measure, a lot of 20th century modernist movements in art have decentered the beautiful. They don't seem to be as concerned with it. And in some cases, I think they're actually hostile to it. So there's a famous, probably maybe the most important painting of the 20th century, which is a Picasso portrait of prostitutes
Mhm.
in Avignon.
Yeah, Les
And
Damoiselles.
yeah, I mean, it's a revolutionary painting, brilliant genius. Um, but it's very disturbing.
Mhm.
And it's quite intentionally, explicitly intentionally ugly.
Mhm.
I mean, part of that is content matter, part of it's his reaction to it. Remember, before the development of sulfa and then penicillin, there's very little treatment that's effective for venereal disease. And these are the transmitters of venereal disease for a guy like Picasso. They're a temptation that's terrifying because this could be his life.
Mhm.
So he makes them sort of harpies. Um, he didn't show it for a while, and there's a story. I don't know if it's true. I suspect it is that when Matisse saw it before he exhibited, he was horrified. I mean, just horrified that you would paint something like that with that sort of malevolence to it. And again, the malevolence is understandable, um, but also that you would think about exhibiting it. And they remained in contact and collaborated much later in life, or at least talked to each other. But I think after that, I see in Matisse a doubling down on the beautiful. It's like beautiful is going to go away now, and we can't let that happen. So, but that's part of what's, I mean, and painting has its canons too. Part of what's interesting about it is you look at the canon and you can track. Well, when beauty went, what came in? What was being refocalized? And, you know, beauty went. That doesn't mean it disappears. The same thing with canon. That no idea go away. Just other things become more important.
I got a chance to check out some of Professor Sugru's treatise, treatments of the great Greek dramas, so tragedies and comedies. So I
Yeah.
find it quite interesting that the comedies of Aristophanes can still garner laughs today, even though what they depict are patently ugly and vulgar. Yeah, it's I suppose he has much influence on guys like Mel Brooks, for example. And the tragedies of, I suppose, Euripides and Sophocles, they have many terrible things happen in them. So I wonder, in Mike's view and in your view, can depictions of ugly things be in turn beautiful?
Well, the depiction of ugly things can be used for beautiful purposes and can be used as part of a larger pattern that is beautiful. So, again, going back to canon, in the 18th century, a British philosopher by the name of Edmund Burke, who would later become sort of the father of conservatism. But before that, he had written on aesthetics. And he wrote a book on the beautiful and the sublime. And he said the sublime is terrifying and it's often ugly, and the beautiful is pleasant. And one of the big elements of his argument is that you need to have both, right? That beauty becomes enervating after a while. It just becomes sort of pretty. And you need to get shocked and woken up by the sublime. But the sublime eventually will just make you neurotic and depressed. So you need to have the beautiful to make you healthy minded. And I think that's true of tragedy too. I think I'm not sure. I think it's Aeschylus, but maybe it's Sophocles who, in one of the cycles, the chorus says, "We suffer into truth." There's a lot of suffering in those stories, but the notion behind it is that suffering will allow us to understand the human condition in a more deep and profound way, and from that, we get something that is true and potentially beautiful.
Yes.
But as for the never-ending comedy of ancient comedies and tragedy of ancient tragedies, when people say that things have changed and old works are not relevant, in some ways that's true. I mean, we don't ride chariots, we drive cars, but unless you think that people are fundamentally a different species now, that they don't have much of the same drives and instincts and concerns, that stuff hasn't changed. And that's mostly what we do with drama, right? Which is why you can take an old play and put it in modern outfit and update it for the modern period, and you still get the same internal dramas. People do this with Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet is moved forward 300 years, set in the 19th century. But it does still capture the basic, human dimension of the conflict. Most of I've seen about 3 Richard III's and a couple Coriolanuses that are set in the 1930s, or one with Ray Fiennes, I think may have been set in like a militaristic Britain of the 1960s. But they still capture the core human relationships and conflicts. So, one is tempted to say things have changed, but that's very often, not entirely, but very often that's the scenery, not the action, which is why the canon endures.
Yes. And another great lecture by Professor Sugru is his take on Shakespeare's Measure for Measure, which, in all accounts, was not one of Shakespeare's most well-known plays. And he makes a case that we can learn a lot from the comedies of Shakespeare, and he believes that uh, too much ink has been spilled over the tragedies, and he certainly makes the case that Measure for Measure is one of his greatest. So, in your view, yeah, what can we learn from the comedies of Shakespeare?
Well, I would extend it beyond Shakespeare, but Shakespeare is exemplary. And we actually had, I think, an unplugged, or we were attending to do an unplugged and couldn't, which is on the importance of tragedy and comedy. And I think, I mean, and Mike nails this in Measure for Measure. Comedy is in some ways about reconciliation, right? What is funny in the play often is our misapprehension or the character's misapprehension. We see, character X thinks character Y is a woman, but he's really a man dressed up in women's clothing. And so it's funny that she falls, that, he's madly in love with this woman who has to play the part of a woman. We know the character is not gay. And so it's funny, this misapprehension. And it would be tragic if that misapprehension could not be revealed later in the play, where the guy's sister, who's acting like a brother, turns out to be a woman, and the character falls in love with that, and then he finds his appropriate one. So it ends with marriage and reconciliation. And in some way, the grand plot of that, and it's true, I think, and often for comedies in general, is that much of our strife in the world is a result of our misunderstanding and misapprehension of each other. And that, whereas in tragedy, that leads to death, in comedy, there's a great reveal. And then it leads to marriage, and it leads to reconciliation. So, example I have, sometimes it's we're not even sure how deep the reconciliation is. So in what is it, Taming of the Shrew, we have this shrew, a woman who's very, neurotic and difficult to deal with, and a guy is bankrupt and she's very wealthy, and her husband will pay him a huge amount of money to marry her. She won't marry anyone. And he's just absolutely depicted to us as manipulative and cold, and he's just interested in taking her money from her. And she is an extremely unsympathetic shrew. And we see him work on her, and he's breaking her. And at the end, she finally falls in love with him, and he's sort of saying, well, what's the sky like today? It's beautiful, isn't it? She says, yes, it is. She says, no, it's not. It's hideous, isn't it? She says, yes, it's hideous. It's like under her thumb, like the Rolling Stones would say. But then at the end, we're reading his speeches about, and his final line, kiss me, Kate. And we're left with, so she misunderstood love and has found it with this guy. And he misunderstood that he was just going to dominate and fleece her. And yet he loves her too. And so they're reconciled. They're going to be a happy couple. Kiss me, Kate. And that's, it says a lot about the conflicts of men and women, and how often they're based on mutual misunderstandings. And once we get past them, so it tells us that a lot of our conflicts in the world are not necessarily in the world, they're in our understanding of the world. And that if we can get beyond that, we get a happy reconciliation. A good comedy is humanizing, because what it points out when we see this guy doesn't see that, and this woman can't see that, and we very often in Shakespeare it's done at multiple levels. So the masters, the so-called aristocrats, get taken in, but so too do their servants. We're in a parallel plot structure. And what it tells us is, despite your status, despite your wealth, we're all pretty much the same. And it reconciles us to our common humanity. And it tells us we're all the same, and why we can't really be angry with each other like we are in tragedy, because at the bottom of it all, we're all foolish. We all get it wrong all the time. And what comedy does is it says, learn to laugh. Laugh at them, but laugh at yourself too. And if you only laugh at them and never at you and yours, that's not comedy. That's satire. That's ridicule. It's also fine, but it's a brutal act. But comedy isn't. In comedy, everyone gets it, right? In the United States, when we did um, it's almost gone now, but there used to be a lot of sitcoms. And the basic rule of a good sitcom was there'd be characters we're meant to like more and dumb, but everyone is the subject of of jest because we're all flawed. We all have, Homer Simpson's an idiot, but Lisa also is kind of ridiculous at points. Marge is good, except Marge is also weird, and Bart is has his, you know, he's not nothing too admirable, but he also has his redeeming points, and that's what comedy does, I think. And that's what I think he saw. Shakespeare maybe exemplifies that more than anyone. This idea of reconciliation, that laughter is a reconciling phenomena, both with us and the world, us and ourselves, and us and each other. Right? That we're all, as it were, foolish. That's just human.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Taming of the Shrew because it has been listed as one of those comedy products that could not be made today, so to speak. I suppose one of my favorite comedy
It has been made recently. Rufus Sewell did a version of it.
Oh, that's wonderful.
It's very good. He's hilarious.
But I think also one of my favorite comedies is Tropic Thunder, directed by Ben Stiller.
Oh, yeah. That's very fun.
And,
Yes, I enjoyed that quite a bit. Yeah,
and
Ben Stiller is great. Nick Nolte's very good in that too. And Robert Downey.
yeah,
Yes, Robert Downey. I forgot about that movie. That was a very fun movie. Yeah.
it's a I think even Robert Downey Jr. himself said that cannot be made today.
No,
Aside from
no.
the race politics, there's also this
Yeah.
Ben Stiller plays a mentally challenged person, and there's this whole tribe in the Philippines or Cambodia that thinks that he's the greatest thing ever, and
Yeah, the character.
and I wonder if in this day and age, how do we circle around this problem of changing sensitivities and sentimentalities that prohibit certain works of comedy be funny?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a really big problem. You know, it's not just that movie. There really haven't been many comedies in a while. And um, one likes to think it's cyclical, that the taste for laughter will come back. But there's also the fear, which is that the human temperament, if you can't laugh, if you can't laugh, you can't laugh at yourself. And if you take yourself that seriously, you're gonna get fierce. So without laughter, life is either tragic or heroic. Either way, tragedies and heroic epics always end in blood, right? Because the stakes are high. And so I think it's um, I think it's imperative to bring back some laughter because it really releases a lot of our anxiety and aggressiveness in a wholesome way. Uh, how to do that, I don't know. I mean, oof, um, there are many forms of comedy. Maybe start with slapstick and physical comedy, cartoons. But once people get in the habit of laughing, it's hard to be as grim. And by laughing, I don't mean just laughing at, right? Because if you're gonna laugh at, you've got to laugh both ways. Um, because that you certainly have, but then it's not really funny so much as cruel, which can be funny sometimes too. Don't get me wrong. I mean, there's much Nietzsche claims there's much cruelty in laughter. He's not wrong about that either. But if it's mutual, the bite comes out. So maybe it's starting with those things. I think once you can get people laughing and looking at the world from a comic perspective, it becomes contagious. And how to break through, I don't know. I guess entertainment venues have sort of bowed to the pressure of seriousness, or comedy that is purely, I don't know how to put it, salacious or physical in a sort of vulgar sense. I mean, I shouldn't say I haven't watched much, but I watched about 10 minutes of a show years ago. I don't have television, called Big Bang Theory. And it was like, I don't know, raunchy frat humor for nerds. Just like, wow. And look, keep it on by all means, laugh. Go ahead and laugh, but gosh, comedy is degenerated if that's considered funny and clever. I mean, yeah, we really need, we need Mel Brooks back,
Mhm.
or Carl Reiner or something like that. But I mean, obviously that show was very successful, so it shows there's still a taste. People still want to laugh. They want to purge some of that energy they have in a constructive way that gives pleasure.
Yes. Yeah, I certainly remember the days when you can quote from comedy, like you would say something to a friend and instantly it's kind of like a code that you share. And I know
Yeah,
that much comedy today it's stand up, and I don't think it's easy to quote from stand up material.
no, and nor would you necessarily want to. The stand-up comic who's following three other comics often has to be outrageous or push envelopes, um, which is fine in that context. It's kind of necessary, but um, it can also be a little bit of a crutch to use obscene. So, I mean, I hadn't considered this too much until I heard an interview with Jerry Seinfeld. And he said, I never use obscenity in my stand-up. And I don't even, if I do talk about sexual themes, it's never in an explicit way. And he said, and the reason is I spend a lot of time writing my material, and that's just a cheap crutch. I mean, anyone can do that. Make them laugh without using vulgarity.
Mhm.
See if you can do it. There's your challenge. And it doesn't mean you can't allude to those things. Sure, they're part of the human experience. But he pulls it off, and he's not unique there. We can do it, but you're right. Very often, going back to Shakespeare, what makes for the full comedy as opposed to the stand-up routine, which I love, by the way, too, sort of vaudevillian, is the dramatic context, which allow us to encapsulate the lessons of comedy in a social and interpersonal context. So, again, another example is Seinfeld. I do occasionally quote lines from Seinfeld to express my point of view. And it's a wonderfully rich environment because you've got four different characters who are each zany and weird in their own different ways. So sometimes you want to make a Kramer point, an Elaine point, a Jerry point, or if you've really become adept, you can identify with George. Because that's actually the key. You're smiling because I think it's hitting you. Part of the trick of comedy is we're going to have someone who we're going to laugh at. And we're going to point out how foolish they are. And it develops your humanity when you realize I actually have a lot in common with that person. I do that sometimes. And so all of us, when I started watching that show, Seinfeld, immediately I found Kramer hilarious because he does pratfalls, right? He does physical comedy, and that's easy to. It's easy, it's Buster Keaton, it's Charlie Chaplin. It's just even children laugh at that, in, instinctually. And then you sort of move up and you start to see, well, Elaine is actually pretty crazy too. She's neurotic, and then Jerry. But the hardest one to identify is George because he's such a loser and he's so he, and that's what humanizes you of that show. If you watch it long enough, you're forced to acknowledge, we all have George Costanza in us. It's all a little Larry David in all of us. And that's like really humanizing because you just can't say, well, what a selfish. No, we've all got a little selfishness. We've all got a little jerk in us. We've all got a little dogmatism. We've all got, the joke about the jerk store. We'll do that occasionally. And yeah, and that laughter, when you do that, it's like, it really changes the way you think about the world. It doesn't change your convictions about the world. It changes the emotional tonality you have towards it. It's one thing to say, people are blind. They need to be taught. And another thing to say, people are blind. You do what you can do. You're not going to teach them. Well, you try. You try. But when they fail, it's human. And you have to be understanding and tolerant about it a little bit. The irony is you also have to be a little bit tolerant and understanding of the fierce people who say that's not acceptable. Because that's also a human thing to do.
Yeah.
I think here of The Misanthrope by Moliere. Very funny. The misanthrope, by the end of the play, is exposed as also a bit of a fool and a fanatic. And he doesn't quite get the lesson at the end. And his best friend and his best friend's soon-to-be wife say, well, we'll have to look after this guy. And what comes from that is he's not a bad guy. That's just some people do that. It's a human proclivity to hold up to an ideal that's not realizable. What makes him comic is he refuses to reconcile with the world the way it actually is. And so it ends without that reconciliation, but with an awareness that we'll accommodate that because he has admirable features.
No. I'm reminded of another great Jerry in comedy, and that is Lewis. I believe in the 50s and the 60s, he did a movie called The Day the Clown Cried. And from what I heard, it's Jerry Lewis playing a clown in the setting of a Holocaust era concentration camp. And it's never been shown.
I never read that. I never saw that one. That sounds really intense.
Yeah, because it's never shown to people. It's been screened to, I suppose it's been screened to a small crowd, but they all thought that Jerry Lewis went a bit too far in this one. But then 4 decades later, Roberto Benigni did the same thing, and he got 2 Oscars for that.
Yeah.
So I wonder how, and I also believe that Jerry Seinfeld cannot really play a tragic character. I do not buy him in that way. So in your view, yeah. So why do you believe that this? Why is it the case that comedians find it difficult to play tragic figures, and I suppose vice versa?
Well, actually, in some cases that may be so, but there are some comic actors who've done a pretty good job playing tragic characters.
Yeah.
Or if not tragic characters, dramatic characters. Robin Williams played one in the tragic character in The Fisher King.
Yeah. Yes.
And he played opposite Jeff Bridges, who is the straight man, the dramatic actor. But he played a comic character in The Big Lebowski, and I thought he was terrific. So it's hard to say. There's some give you a pretty darn good comedic actor today, and that's Steve Carell.
Yes.
And now that we don't do comedies anymore, there's no comic acting because they don't do that anymore. He's done some really amazing tragic performances. Foxcatcher. Very, very effective. He was in, or is it The Big Short? He was very good in that too. So I'm not sure. Actually I think at least in the United States, comedians tend to do the transition to dramatic and tragic better
Hmm.
than tragic actors can do towards comedy. And another example of this is, believe it or not, this is like way back. Tom Hanks was not a dramatic actor; he's a
Yes.
comedian.
Yeah. And
But he's been a pretty good, dramatic actor. And I think part of that is in the United States, not all, but a lot of the training in acting was done around the Russian method of introducing your own emotional experience into it. And comedy, by contrast, good comic acting is always based on um, precise control over your physicality, over your timing of when you speak. It's never about expressing what's inside of you. Quite the opposite. It's about manner, and sort of the way many British act. And so it's much easier if you have those skills to transition to dramatic acting than it is from dramatic to comedic, where timing is critical. You tell a joke sometimes, and you have to, the humor comes from sitting in like 12 seconds of silence. And the building tension is what's funny in the delivering of a punchline. So it's all about timing, and it's all about don't express yourself. Look, I mean, Buster Keaton was the genius at this. It's just the face is always the same. It's not that Buster Keaton didn't have emotions. I mean, obviously he does. That's a discipline. That's to achieve a particular effect. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. In British film, I don't see that distinction. I see comedic actors doing comedy pretty well, and comedic actors doing serious roles pretty well. In the United States, I can't remember the last dramatic actor I've seen do a decent job in a comedic role. I mean, actually, I can, and it was a while ago, and it was Robert Downey Jr. in Robert Downey in Tropic of Thunder. And he was very, very funny in that. But I don't think he's done a comedic role since. And I can't think. I mean, I know there was a movie with Tom Hanks and Sally Field like 20 years ago where she's learning to be a stand-up comic. So it's about this kind of process. Um, so they obviously trained her to do it. And I just thought, no, it didn't work. It's not very good, not funny.
yes. So if comedy depends on having an audience, then how can written material be funny?
Because we are the audience when we
Oh,
read it. We're imagining it. The same way that a tragic play also requires an audience. But when we read it, we are that audience.
mhm.
So when we read it, a comedy, we may not laugh out loud because we're plotting it and imagining how it's going to be blocked and people are going to move. But nonetheless, we're internally smiling because we get the joke. If it's a comedy that we can identify with, we can't always, right? I mean, some comedies are just either the joke is no longer relevant to us, or the pretext, the context for the humor is something we just can't share. I mean, I would find it hard to imagine many people would find a minstrel show today funny.
Yes.
We just, have too much bad. And similarly, you get, I've noticed the various versions of The Merchant of Venice um, struggle. They wind up turning it into a tragedy, but it's not. It's a comedy. What you had to understand is there were no Jews in England. They just hated Jews. So you make the Jew the villain, and he gets hurt, and it's funny. It's good. We don't feel that way anymore. So um, either we can't do it, or when we do it, we try to turn him into a tragic hero who horribly abused. but then we can't make sense of the marriage at the end and the reconciliation.
Yeah. I'm actually reminded a film that Spike Lee made, Bamboozle, that was released in 2000, and it aimed to answer exactly the question that you raised earlier, which is, would contemporary audiences find a minstrel show funny? And apparently, within the context of the movie, the answer is surprisingly and terrifyingly yes.
Well, I will defer to him. Mr. Lee knows far more about the genre than I ever will. And if that turns out to be the case, then it's not good. But actually, if people can decontextualize it and say, there is physicality here that's funny, but I don't incorporate the larger context from which it comes, or I laugh at it as an historical antique in the same way I can laugh at Merchant of Venice without sharing its ethos. That's okay.
So, who would you characterize as a funny philosopher?
Funny philosopher. That's an interesting. I would certainly say that some of them are witty and amusing. Uh, Funny, I don't know. So witty. One can't help but smile and titter a bit reading Rochefoucauld, the Maxims, or I actually do laugh occasionally reading Mandeville, particularly as what is it, the origins of virtue. It's very, and some of it is actually Mandeville wrote a very audacious essay called "A Modest Defense of Public Stews." This is about as obscure as the Jerry Lewis movie you pointed to. And so in early 18th century Britain, there was a large movement known as to reform manners, to get rid of vice. And one of the big vices was, and the same as in Picasso's time, was prostitution. And so Mandeville wrote a modest defense, a proposal for basically state-run brothels. A stew was a brothel. And there'd be various categories. There'd be the high-ranking, prostitutes for the middling sort, poor prostitutes. There'd be medical inspections to make sure that, venereal disease isn't transmitted. And so it's not an unserious proposal. I mean, he knows it'll never happen, but he says, we trying to do something like this in the Netherlands where he's from. But it's preceded with, it's really funny, like a 40-page preface on philosophers and, how should we put it, sexual intrigue. So he's like, we always treat philosophers as being people of great moral virtue. But then he just goes through the catalog from the ancients up to the modern. Well, this one had this fetish. I think he's making some of it up, but a lot of it is just hilarious. So and so pandered his own sister, which is like prostituted his own sister. Plato really liked this, and it could be straight Monty Python. So he's pretty funny. Hume can be quite witty, very often with double entendre. Who else can be funny? I know I'm hitting a lot of guys in like the late 17th and early 18th, and through the 18th century, because that was the age of laughter. That was, the Enlightenment, what K. Clark called the smile of reason, where it's not that there wasn't a period of social criticism there. There absolutely was, but it was often done in playful and comic ways. Think of the novels of Voltaire, Candide, Zadig, Jacques the Fatalist by Diderot. These were very playful and funny things. Cervantes is involved in the same project with Don Quixote. It's a hilarious novel, right? It's very comic. It has a tragic ending, but it's very comic. So, I mean, again, that's a novel, but that's um, pretty philosophically relevant. Machiavelli wrote a comic play called The Mandragola,
Yeah.
which I've never found particularly funny, but he obviously did. It is a comedy. Um, I don't know that I put him down as a funny philosopher. Um, Others do use humor occasionally. There are, believe it or not, and one of the driest philosophers in the American tradition, Willard Quine, there's occasionally he drops in these little witticisms that are, clever and cutting, like when he critiques the idea of intentional with an S ideas, he says there's a creeping suspicion that the idea is not respectable. Or when he attacks conceptualism and realism, he says, well, it's time to shave Plato's beard. That's his description of nominalism, and celebrate the aesthetics, the beauty of desert landscapes. Get rid of all of those formal bric-a-brac in there. The possible ideal person in the corner. Dry humor, but it's an attempt.
I think I'd like to end on this note. What do you remember about the humor of Professor Michael Sugru?
Uh, Several things. First, it was always, how do I put this, warm-hearted, right? Which is to say, he pointed out foibles. He did. I mean, it was, you know, um, but he pointed out foibles across the board because he did. I mean, there's one thing that I probably got from him. I don't remember, but he probably drilled it into my head, which is that comedy is, when it's effective, humanizing, and that you can't laugh at someone else if you're not prepared to laugh at yourself. Because otherwise, you're not doing comedy. You're just a bully, right? Um, and so I think he lived by that. He also liked, it's very strange, it's sort of Dada kind of humor. He liked the humor of the absurd, and he would point out really absurd things. Um, he, he had a roommate who, they collected something called the Museum of the Rude. What is that? Well, they would actually just find things at a grocery store or someplace else that were, if taken out of context, insanely rude, like bizarre. And it was actually very comic, like a certain potted meat product that would apparently last forever. They bought a tiny tin of it and put it on a shelf for people to expect. And Lord knows what's in that. It was just rude. Believe it or not, in the 1980s, there were companies that sold things like plastic vomit that you would put on the floor. So they'd say, you're really going to sell this? So they buy a little plastic vomit. See, that's, this is the museum of, or his roommate name was Tim. We call it Tim's House of Rude. All sorts of things like that. Buy a pet rock or a Cabbage Patch doll or whatever. So it was also very broad and self-aware. And also, as I say, he liked sort of absurd humor. So he liked certain performance artists who were funny but strange. Yeah, I guess that's what I'd say. He loved humor. He loved laughter, but his tastes were very broad, and sometimes he could appreciate a good obscure joke, like in a surrealist painting, and just see the humor in it.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Professor Darren
Thank
Stell.
you so much. It's great speaking to you.
Likewise.